Welcome, everyone. I'm Tom Clays and president of the Santa Monica Conservancy, and I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon for the first of our 2021 Mosaic lectures. Some of you may be familiar with the Conservancy, but our mission, for those of you that are not, the Conservancy is a historic preservation organization organized much like the LA Conservancy and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We're an educational and advocacy group that focuses on Santa Monica and the immediately surrounding area. Through our efforts over the last 18 years, we become the leading voice in the community for embracing historic preservation and adaptive reuse while celebrating all our historic communities and their memories. We want to thank our sponsors, Boston Properties and Pankow Builders, for making this first set of lectures in 2021 possible. Boston Properties is the largest publicly traded developer and owner of Class A office properties in the US. They have a major presence in Santa Monica, where they own Colorado Center and the Santa Monica Business Park. Pankow is a pioneer of design, build, and integrated project delivery, providing general contracting for commercial, education, healthcare, residential, and tenant improvement services throughout the US. I want to thank those who have already made a donation to the Conservancy related to this lecture. During the program, you'll have the opportunity to donate or join the Conservancy by either using the chat function, which is at the bottom of your screen. You just click it and there'll be two links that'll appear. You can either contribute or join, or alternatively, there's a phone number that'll appear a couple times. It's on the screen now, where you text and enter the phone number. Text give and enter the phone number. So with that, I want to turn it over to Libby Motika to start our program.
Thank you, Tom. Welcome to our second season of webinar series, concentrating on the communities whose history and culture have contributed a vital piece to the mosaic we call Santa Monica. Today's lecture will feature the Japanese community, and our featured guest, Dr. Dennis Ogawa, will reflect on his personal memories of beginning being, he won't remember this, beginning with having been born in Manzanar, and later his childhood and education in Santa Monica. But before I introduce Dr. Ogawa, I'd like to give you all a little bit of background on the presence of the Japanese in Los Angeles. I also want to remind you that you can ask questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will have a Q&A session after Dr. Ogawa's speech. Persons of Japanese ancestry have lived in the Los Angeles area since at least 1870. And we know this because the census of that year counted 2 Japanese residents. But as of 2017, there were an estimated 110,000 residents of Los Angeles County, solely or partially of Japanese ancestry. After the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and that, as you remember, the United States forbade more immigration from China. Japanese immigration to the United States increased dramatically throughout the 1800s. By 1910, Los Angeles had the highest percentage of Japanese and Japanese descendants in the country. Once recruited to come to the United States to work on the railroads, they quickly turned to agriculture as a means of work in Southern California. After the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco, many Japanese Americans migrated to Los Angeles and settled in the area that we would eventually call Little Tokyo. By the 20s and 30s, they began to migrate east on along First Street to Boyle Heights. Boyle Heights was a logical place because it did not have restricted housing covenants, which forbade Japanese and other people of color to own property. By the 30s, the Boyle Heights area had become a mecca for Japanese community. They constructed temples and schools and churches. But there were 2 other settlements that the Japanese settled far from Little Tokyo. One was on the west side of Los Angeles that we now know as the Sawtelle area. Slide number 1. This is the Hashimoto Nursery. And since 1926, this establishment on Sawtelle Boulevard has been in the hands of 3 generations of Hashimoto's. And it continues to serve the quality plants and friendly service to members of the West Side. So the area continues to have not only nurseries that are not only on Sawtelle, but other places. And Sawtelle also is a mecca for Japanese restaurants, markets, and retail stores. The other area where the Japanese settled was Long Beach, particularly Terminal Island, where they worked almost exclusively in fishing and in the canneries. The Japanese came to Santa Monica later than the Chinese. While the Chinese lived and worked among other residents of the city, the Japanese initially lived apart in a little village dedicated to mostly fishing, located past Santa Monica on the north side of the Long Wharf. Next slide. The 4,720-foot Long Wharf opened in 1893. This was Collis Huntington's effort to name Santa Monica Bay as the deep port for Los Angeles. Alas, he lost out to Long Beach, San Pedro, and the Long Wharf was demolished eventually in 1920. The village's founding member was Hatsuji Sano, who arrived in Port Los Angeles in 1899 and began leasing property from the Southern Pacific Railroad. Over time, the village's population grew to about 300, all nestled at the base of the cliffs, just next to the wharf in small wooden houses built on the sand. Next slide. This is a picture of the Japanese village, and as you can see the wharf in the background. This is right at the base of the Palisades in Santa Monica. Despite the somewhat precarious beach location where winter tides sometimes inundated the homes, the little town thrived. There was even a small Methodist church, and for schooling, the Japanese children attended Canyon Elementary, where they learned English and studied alongside the other kids. Exploiting the bounty of Santa Monica Bay and its environs, the village's 30 boats commonly pulled in about 30 tons of fish a day, mostly large species, tuna, yellowfin, and mackerel. Much of their catch was shipped via early morning train leaving the Long Wharf to Los Angeles. The village also served the Los Angeles Japanese community in another way by providing a tourist getaway for successful merchants from Little Tokyo, and also for Japanese visitors from abroad. In 1909, a Japanese named Kichiro Waseda is credited with establishing the first hotel to cater to Japanese people. The Rakukan was located in Santa Monica Canyon. Eventually, there were at least 3 tourist inns in the village, as well as less attractive shacks to house the workers on the railroad. But aside from lodging, by 1914, there were movies being made in the village. The site of 18,000 acres, which extended up Santa Ynez Canyon, some 7.5 miles, became the location of many Western movies in the early days. Next slide. The site housed a small municipality of some 700 people with sets and stages designed to represent, Switzerland, or a Puritan settlement, or a Japanese village, a native Indian encampment, and certainly the famous film set for Civilization, which was located near the site of the present-day Marquez Elementary School. Like other filmmakers attracted to Southern California during the era, The Japanese companies brought Japanese actors to the village for filming and then sent the results to Japan to be enjoyed by the Japanese moviegoers. The most renowned actor of the early 20th century was Seisui Hayakawa, who was the first and one of the few Asian actors to find stardom in both the United States and Europe. Next slide. During his first stay in Los Angeles, Hayakawa discovered the Japanese theater in Little Tokyo, and he became fascinated with acting and performing plays. In one of the productions he performed was called The Typhoon, and a young woman named Tatsuro Aoki, a member of the troupe, saw him, and she was so impressed with Hayakawa's abilities and enthusiasm that she recommended him to the famous producer Thomas Ince. The well-known producer saw the production and immediately offered to turn it into a silent movie starring the original cast. But anxious to return to his studies at the University of Chicago, Hayakawa decided to dissuade Ince by requesting the absurdly high fee of $500 a week. Ince agreed to pay it. The Typhoon was filmed in 1914, and it was an instant hit. Hayakawa made 2 more films with Ince, The Wrath of the Gods, co-starring his new wife, Tatsuro Aoki, and The Sacrifice. Next slide. This is a movie poster from The Wrath of the Gods, 1914, film directed by Thomas Ince and starring Seisui Hayakawa. Next slide. This is a set for The Wrath of the Gods. This is clearly a Japanese village, and you can see the poster painted in the background. Next slide. Again, from the same set, you see a confusion and a rickshaw running down the street. Next slide. And this is the cast picture from the Wrath of the Gods, starring Seisui Hayakawa and his wife Tatsuro Aoki. With his popularity, Hayakawa's salary soared. He was one of the highest paid stars of the time, making $5,000 a week in 1915 and $2 million a year via his own production company during the 20s. His international fame also transitioned both silent films and talkies. And it's interesting to remember that at the time he was as popular as Douglas Fairbanks and Charlie Chaplin. Perhaps the audience would maybe recall him in The Bridge on the River Kwai, where he played Colonel Saito, for which he was nominated for a Best Supporting Role in 1957. Alas, the film heyday in Santa Monica Canyon was cut short in 1916 when a fire destroyed most of the structures, including 2 inns and a store. And by 1920, the city had condemned the village and the buildings were razed. Many of the Japanese families who called the village home moved to Terminal Island, where they built another settlement and resumed fishing. But the presence in Santa Monica did not die with the fishing village. Some Japanese remained and other newcomers arrived. But by the 1920s, there were Japanese residents living in the canyon, in Mid-City, and in Ocean Park, forming the seeds of what would become an active community. And now I would like to introduce the main attraction, Dr. Dennis Ogawa. Dr. Ogawa has received his PhD from UCLA, and he is a professor and former chair of the University of Hawaii American Studies Department. He has written several books, including The World of Hawaii's Japanese Americans, and For the Sake of the Children, and the first Nisei. So I would like to welcome Dr. Ogawa, and I presume you're speaking to us from your office in Honolulu. Please welcome Dr. Ogawa. Thank you.
Thank you, Libby, for the introduction. I want to start by saying, as a Japanese American, I traced my roots to Japan and a place in Japan. It's a small beach town, and it's on the coast of the Japan Sea. And you're not going to forget Japanese town, because the name of the Japanese town is Obama, and Obama means small beach. And the students I teach at the University of Hawaii, they always kid me, and when they introduce me, they will always say, "This is Ogawa from Obama." Also, and introduced as someone who was born in a concentration camp, and that's in California, Manzanar. And I want to share with you something that my mother would always tell me, about being born. And what she would say is that I made grandma and grandpa, and this is the Issei, the first of Japanese Americans, and all their friends, because everyone was put out of Santa Monica and then Los Angeles and Southern California into the concentration camp. Families, of various generations. And my mother would always say that the Issei were so happy that I was born, and a concentration camp. And that always kind of made me wonder, be happy. They're behind barbed wire. We were all placed in a concentration camp and I'm born. So my auntie, that's the younger sister of my mother. She helped baby in the concentration camp along, with my grandfather and grandmother. My mom and dad, they had to work in the concentration camp. My dad was farming, and my mother was working in an office in the concentration camp. So my grandpa and my auntie, would babysit me. And recall something that my auntie said to me, and I want to share it with you because it helped me understand, why the East would just be happy that a child was born, in a concentration camp. My auntie, as time goes on, after, seeing me grow up, and then eventually even going to college, and then eventually becoming, a college professor at the University of Hawaii, she, came to Hawaii, just to see me. And I was so happy, that we went out and we went to a restaurant. And it was a restaurant that my buddy owned, and it was sushi, raw fish and this kind of restaurant. My auntie loved, sushi. She loved raw fish. And so we went, and my buddy, he went all out, and he created this, for us to eat. And so my auntie would say, "Oh, this is really great." And was thanking me. And I said, "Yeah, isn't this really great?" But my auntie, she's so honest that what she also said to me was, "But she's tasted better." So then, I said, "Oh yeah, probably because, you've traveled in Japan and you've been to different places, in Japan and, and all this." And she said, the best raw fish and sushi made from fish that she ever ate was in. And then that kind of threw me off. And I said, Manzanar, Manzanar is like in the desert, and it's like 300, 400 miles away from the Pacific Ocean. And what my auntie told me was that, in the concentration camp, Japanese Americans, in Southern California, Los Angeles, and, some were fishermen. And like what Libby was saying in terms of, a fishing town, and they fished the bay with other fishermen, in Santa Monica, Southern California. And fishermen are very close. They have a bond with each other because they love the ocean, but And if anybody has problems out in the ocean, like a storm, they will all go out, to try to help. So what happened is that when the war started and then the order came that Japanese Americans would be removed from California and placed in a concentration camp, the fishermen, and this is like fishermen in San Pedro and Terminal Island, others, the Japanese fishermen then would be taken away from, their place, their home, and they would be in camp. And the other fishermen, they were very upset. They said, that's not right. And these are Caucasian, these are Portuguese, Italian, Latinos, and others who all fished together. And they were so upset. So they made a vow, a promise. The promise was that every week, the best, freshest fish that they caught, they were going to ice and bring to Manzanar so that their fishing friends in the concentration camps would have fish for the family and to share with others in Manzanar. And when you hear these kinds of stories, these are people, good people, trying to take care of others. So if you're an Issei in a concentration camp and you look out through that barbed wire, you're not going to be saying that all of them out there are racist, horrible country, to put us in prison behind barbed wire. What they're going to say as they look out through that barbed wire is that they got friends out there. There are good people out there. And they want to kind of go back and be with them. Grandchild is born, or if an offspring is born in the camp, they want their offspring to get to know the friends out there, grow up and be with their friends' family as well. And so they were happy that they had an offspring because they had good friends out there. They loved America. They made a serious decision in their life. And that decision is that they were going to work and cast their lot together with everyone in America to help build a community that they can all call home. They ceased, the Issei first generation, they ceased to live in Japan, never ceased loving Japan. And loving Japan made them no less American. They loved American as well. They loved America as well because America was a place of people who were inclusive of others. They were good people. And for the Issei, happy, that a child will be born as an American of Japanese ancestry. And so that kind of really made me kind of understand how lucky I was that the Issei, were raising me as an American of Japanese ancestry, someone who loved America and loved Japan. My dad, when the war was over and we were released from the concentration camp, and my dad wanted to go back to Santa Monica. The store, he had a store there in Santa Monica, a small grocery store on 4th and Pico. And my mom worked at the store. And because it was on Pico and close to the beach, the store was making money because people, after they went to the beach, Los Angeles or whatever, they would stop at the store to get soda or ice cream. And the store was also located in the Black community. And they had very good customers. There's a working community. People were poor, but people were working, and the store was, had good customers. Right next to my dad's store was this little shack. It was like a shed, and this one very elderly poor man from the South, was living there. And my dad would always, when he had extra food and all from the store, would bring it over, to him. Would come to the store to help my dad if he thought my dad needed help, lifting packages or doing something with. And they became good friends. And his name was Mr. Magnum. And my dad was determined to come back to Santa Monica after the war, but he lost everything. He lost the store. They had built a new house in Michigan and Lincoln Boulevard. And they lost all that. But he was determined still to come back to Santa Monica. And he said, whatever work was needed, but we were going to live in Santa Monica. So he took a job as a dishwasher, and my mom as a house cleaner. But, to come back to Santa Monica, there's no housing. There's a huge house in California, and especially in Santa Monica, and it was almost impossible, to find a place. It to us and to my father is to stay with him, until my dad could find a place. And so for the first month, returning from the concentration camp, we stayed with Mr. Magnum. And this wasn't just in a one-room kind of a shack. It with a little running water, and they had a toilet, but the rest was a floor. And my mom and my dad, they slept on the floor, and Mr. Magnum and we slept on the floor under the kitchen table. And to me, it was kind of cozy. It was like, and I could cuddle up to Mr. Magnum, but that's, this was like a 2-3-year-old child, growing up. Mr. Magnum would be my babysitter. He actually was the one who raised me in the early days because my mom and dad, were working. Me, how to speak English and English words. And it was interesting because I would learn Mr. Magnum. And so the words I would pronounce, even to this day, would have a Southern Black accent. I have Dwayne, but I call him Duane, and things like that. Mr. Magnum would also teach me English, but Japanese and Japanese words. And the reason is because, my dad basically spoke Japanese. And so he would teach Mr. Magnum. And Mr. Magnum then would teach me the Japanese words that he learned from my father, but he would teach me Japanese with a Southern Black accent. So I would speak some Japanese words and all, but it would be with a Southern Black accent. And I sometimes a Japanese word would come out of my mouth, and she would go, huh, huh, and then it would dawn on her that, Mr. Magnum was kind enough to try to teach me Japanese. I always remembered, one day Mr. Magnum's, talking with me, and he says something to me. And what he says is, I'm Black, and I'm also Japanese. And that always stuck with me, because what he meant by all that is we all family. Doesn't matter what color, doesn't matter how rich you are, how much. We all family. And that was a great teaching lesson. And it stuck with me. Mr. Magnum was a great teacher, growing up. And then I was very fortunate because I went to kindergarten, and it was Garfield Elementary School. I had a wonderful kindergarten teacher. The kindergarten that I went to, and this is my first kindergarten class. This is the kindergarten class. And the children were basically, working, basically more poor, Black and Latino, families who grew up in kindergarten all together. And I never forgot that and it was during Christmas time. She, with her own money, bought a big Christmas tree and brought it to the classroom. And she also brought, some of her own on Christmas trees, and then taught us how to put some decorations on Christmas tree, and so we spent, the whole morning and decorating a Christmas tree. And that was, the first time, for me in Christmas. And we took a break, and some of we went out and we were playing in the recess, just kickball. It's a ball on the asphalt, sort of playground. And what happened with the ball was when we kicked it, it bounced on the cement, and then it bounced. But it bounced and went up through an open window in the classroom. And so the ball goes through the open window on the classroom floor, and then it bounced back up and it hit the Christmas tree. And the Christmas tree just collapsed, fell, and the decorations were all broken, and the students in the classroom were in shock. And we came into the classroom, and we thought, and the guys, we thought we were going to get it, we were scared, because we had something thought. And when we came in, Mrs. Hamilton, the first thing she said to all of us was, "Oh, you know what? Let's go into another room. Where I have Christmas cookies for you, boys and girls, and I want to bake Christmas cookies for you. Okay, so let's go into the other room, huh? And I also, brought milk." So we went into the other Christmas cookies, and she never talked about the Christmas tree, and the ball, and she never got mad. All she said was, "We're good children." And she said one other thing: accidents happen. That's it. Accident. She didn't even really talk about the Christmas tree, but we all knew, and it was, and she didn't get mad, and that stuck with me. I would go on, and then eventually on Adams Junior High School. And in junior high school, I was very fortunate because I had another great teacher, and he was a physical education, Mr. Plummer. And he was a great teacher. He taught us about team sports, team. And he also taught us sports, but it was the fundamentals of throwing a ball, the fundamentals of ball and baseball or football. It wasn't like showboating or doing something fancy, And he was like a Johnny Wooden, of UCLA, and fundamentals. And so that's the way we were growing up, and all of us loved sports, and we were growing up as different teams. And one of the favorite sports for all of us growing up at John Adams was volleyball. And so, but there was only 2 courts, and it was on a cement kind of asphalt playground of teams. And so we had a system where we would race, and each team would pick who they thought were the fastest, racer, and they would represent the team, and then we would race, and the first to touch the volleyball court floor, with their foot, the team that would get to play on the court, and then the second team, the second best, and the third, and all that. So we would race, and I was, would be the racer because I was kind of sort of fast. And so we started and we raced, and the other racers, they were pretty tall, with long legs, and I was short, but I was really fast, off the start. And so it looked like I was going to win as we got closer to the volleyball court. And I was about to touch the volleyball court, with my foot. And I was going like full throttle, and I got tripped from the back. And I hit, and when I hit that cement, I hit so hard that both my arms were bloody and my knees were bloody, because when you hit, skipping as well and sliding, on the asphalt cement. And this, really, in terms of the students were screaming, some of the students ran to get Mr. Plummer, and Mr. Plummer came with two nurses. Some of my buddies, they were going to kill the guy, who tripped me. Huh? And I'm there, and Mr. Plummer and all there, and all I say is accident. I didn't say anything else. I just said accident. And the nurses took me into the nursing room. That's all I said, accident. That year, was our senior year. Time to graduate. It was a large, graduation assembly, and the parents were there, and the whole graduating class. My mother came to be with me, and the first person to speak on the stage was the school principal, and talked about a class. Then the second person was a teacher, and the teacher would give smartest student award. But what also happened was that Mr. Plummer, came up, and Mr. Plummer said, was that John Adams is going to start another award, and this will be the first, but it'll be a perpetual award. They would do the same award, and this will be called the Sportsman of the Year Award. And so Mr. Plummer announced who the Sportsman of the Year, would be, and he called my name, and I was in shock. I didn't say anything. It was kind of embarrassing that my name was called. So Mr. Plummer came down, and he brought me up to the stage, and I was speechless. I couldn't say anything. So all I said was just, thank you. And I was, the Sportsman of the Year. And, Mr. Plummer, it was because I never got mad. I just said accident. And sportsmanship, is you don't get mad. You're a good sport. So then, I go to, and I was even fortunate enough to letter, in sports. And then, when we applied for college, I was very fortunate. I got into UCLA. And when you apply for college, and some of my friends got into UCLA, and they applied because they were a major or a chemist, and UCLA had that, and so they would apply, to be a major in chemistry or math or even physics. And my application, I applied to be a PE coach, to be a PE teacher. And everyone was kind of shocked because, those are the big time athletes. UCLA was known as, super, almost like Olympics. And as I look back, I think part of the reason I was accepted at UCLA because I was Sportsman of the Year Award, person, at John Adams. And that's Mrs. Hamilton, Mr. Plummer. Time goes on, and I eventually, graduated UCLA. I was a PE major, and then I was an English minor, and that led to the field of communication for me, and then eventually a PhD in communications. And then I became a professor, and I've been teaching at the University of Hawaii now for over 52 years. And every year I try my best to come back to Santa Monica, and particularly, after my mom and dad, and I would always, walk to, and I still to this day, I walk to Woodland Cemetery, pay respect to my mom and dad's, that we have at Woodland Cemetery. And then I walk and I go to the monument, which was built by the Nikkei And these are the Nikkei Hall members, which is just down the block. And I would walk by Nikkei Hall, and my dad was a member. Nikkei Hall is like the Japanese families who lived in Santa Monica, and it was like the gathering place, in Japanese culture. And I can recall that, my dad, he was part of the group that helped build a monument, at Woodlawn Cemetery of the Issei. And that monument, which is, a granite, very large and white, it's a monument to the Issei. And so when I go to Woodlawn, Mom and Dad's niche, I go to the monument and I think of Nikkei Hall. That's my dad, and Mom at Woodlawn Cemetery niche. But then I go, to the monument as well, and I look at the monument and pay my respect to the Issei. It's the monument to honor the Issei. And I find myself, always feeling how fortunate I am. That I'm so fortunate that I had grandparents. I had Issei grandparents who loved Japan, who were so happy that a child was born of American Japanese, and I was an American born, with Japanese, background. And so, I just look at it and it just makes me happy. It makes me so fortunate that I'm an American of Japanese ancestry. Also, after Woodlawn, I walked down on Pico Boulevard. I walked to the beach. And Santa Monica Beach is, where I grew up just playing with our. And two of my buddies, I scattered their ashes there, and I will be joining them, when I pass away. And part of my ashes will be scattered at Santa Monica Waters. But my ashes will also be scattered, at the beach, a beach in Waikiki area, Oahu, Honolulu. And that's where, my son and I, would go fishing. And the last part of it scattered at Obama, my ancestral, homeland in terms of town. And so, I'm really thankful for being able to share some of these, memories with you. They're very precious memories. And I really thank the Conservancy, for this program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dennis. I have one little addendum before we begin the Q&A.
Great.
And this has to do with the good news about the Nikkei Social Hall. Last summer, the city of Santa Monica approved an affordable housing project on the site of the landmarked hall. The original structure will be integrated into the new design to enhance public awareness of the historic site. So that's a good ending for the important cultural memory of the Issei, or the first generation of Japanese in the Santa Monica area. And now I would like to begin some questions. I see we have a couple, so I will begin. This is from somebody who wants to know, Dennis, please tell us where your family lived from the time forward from Pico and forth.
Ocean Park area. It's on Beverly and Kensington, that area. And I would always just walk straight down and come down Strand and go to the ocean. And our hangout with my buddies would be Lifeguard 22, the station, 22. But that's where I grew up. more in the Ocean Park area.
Mhm. And did your family then be able to buy or build a new home eventually?
Yes, and so, the house is, at that time there was segregation, and it was hard to house certain areas. Um, and my dad and mom, they felt very lucky because they have a really nice piece of property in Santa Monica on the house, and it's walkable to the beach. Um, um, but I think the reason was because there's a Black family next door, and I think there's discrimination related to that, and so we were able to buy the house, my father and all, because it was more a Black neighbor. The Black family, we were very, very close. And as I said, I grew up with Mr. Magnum, and my dad's store, was in a Black area. In many ways, the connections in terms of working and living with Black, I'm very indebted to.
Dennis, we have a question about, which I'm sure other people would like to know. It is a question about, did you ever ask your parents anything about their time at Manzanar? Did they ever talk about it with you?
No, it was, I guess you would say, more Japanese style, huh? In terms of at least my parents' outlook. And if they ever talked about Manzanar, it was that they missed Santa Monica. That's what I remember. And I could also remember my mother always saying the greatest weather in the world was Santa Monica weather, and she just wanted to go back, to Santa Monica. And so she would compare Manzanar, like it was a nice place in its own way, but it was Santa Monica.
What a great attitude.
No. But she
Now I
really
know where
did.
you get your optimism. My goodness.
No, but I'm very spoiled because, here I am, all right? My ancestral roots are a small, beautiful beach town in Japan, and also have a home in Hawaii and Santa Monica. Mm-hmm. And I grew up on the beach, and it's just a wonderful sort of life. Yeah.
I have a question. It's related to Manzanar. This woman says her name is Lori Matsumura. And recently she says, my grandfather, Giichi Matsumura, was rediscovered on Mount Williamson. He and my family were in Manzanar. Have you heard of our family? Do you have any stories about them? I saw my grandmother and great-grandfather in your Nikkei Hall picture. Wow.
Yes, and I always remember your grandfather. He was like the founder, the senior elder, of the Nikkei Hall. And he was very close to my father. My father adored him. And I remember when my father bought the Santa Monica house, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, he would come, and this is a really old man. And he would, walk like, I don't know, about 600 blocks and help my dad, cut the trees, that block the driveway coming, to the house. And I always remember that, he was really someone special. And in terms of Manzanar and the mountain, and the story of, the people fishing in Manzanar. I was, happy to say that I was involved in that documentary, and those memories, are very important, for future generations to know as well.
Dennis, did you ever spend time at the Nikkei Social Hall? Did you go with your father or mother? And
oh yes.
What did they do there? Did they play games or eat or what?
It was eating. That's all I remember. And it was like New Year's time, and everyone would come with different foods. But what I also remember about Nikkei is like, they had like a little parking area as well. And so people would all park together, and then they would take a bus to go on a picnic, like to Griffith Park.
Oh.
And I remember we even went to Lake Arrowhead. And, for me, it was just so much fun. Plus, it was always great because the mothers would make bento or, Japanese lunches, and everyone would share, with everyone else. And I really remember, one time where we would join other Japanese, at Griffith Park, and they were part of other organizations. So it would be like a great picnic is what it was called. Where there'd be large gatherings of Japanese together, and they would be there with their friends. And my dad would say they had a lot of friends who knew each other because of the concentration camp. Because we were all thrown in together, in Los Angeles and all. But if I really like to share with you, something about the Kenjin-kai and that picnic, going on the picnic. I never forgot that at the picnic, and it was not just once a time, it was like every summer. The friends that would come would not only be Japanese, about Caucasians and Latino and blacks, and this one man would come. And he was really old. He almost looked homeless, and so he had big bushy hair and a big beard, and really old. But he was friends with everyone, okay. And and I heard my mom tell me, tell some others, and then she told me later on that his name is Gabby Hayes.
Oh.
And I go, Gabby, well, who's that? And things started to come together. My grandpa lived in Little Tokyo in California, in LA. And Little Tokyo had a Japanese movie house, which was black and white movies of samurai movie house. Okay. So every time we would go to Little Tokyo, almost every week to see grandma and grandpa, we would end up watching a Japanese samurai movie, with grandpa. So I grew up that way as a little kid. But then grandpa would come visit us in Santa Monica. And we would always go to a movie when grandpa came. It would be this theater called Hitching Post. And it was always cowboy movies. And we would go, and I grew up in samurais, but watching Hopalong Cassidy, and Roy Rogers, and a guy named Tom Mix and something else, And why? It's because Mr. Magnum, I mean not Mr. Magnum, but Hayes, was in there, and he was part of the cowboy movies. But the bigger story is that the cowboy movies were all shot in the Alabama mountains, which is Manzanar. It's real close to Manzanar. So the Hollywood movies would be shot there, and the Western shows, Mr. Gabby Hayes, would come to the concentration camp with pies and other things, because some of the Japanese at his house were gardeners, and then they got all taken to the concentration camp, and this is the gardeners that he would do the picnics with. When we had at Griffith Park. But because Gabby Hayes came, he would come with Hopalong Cassidy or Roy Rogers, and they would come with food, for the concentration camp. And so every time I have the cowboy movies, I cry. It's grandma, grandpa, but I'm a Japanese American, and my grandfather loved cowboy shows, but it was also because of human relationships. And Gabby Hayes, because of the Nikkei Hall, going on a bus and going on picnics to Griffith Park. And it's those kind of stories that, that come together, are precious for me as I look back now.
We have another question. This has to do with why did the Japanese settle in Sawtell versus Santa Monica? And I can say what I know. The Sawtell at the time was an unincorporated area. It had to do with what they call the old soldiers' home. And it was also free of restrictive housing covenants. So the Japanese could make a life and live in the Sawtell area, and they built little houses. And the Sawtell area was in fact very multicultural. It was a really great place for what we always want, which is diversity. As I said to you, the first nursery, the Hashimoto nursery, was started in 1926. And this question also wants to know what years did Sawtell develop? I would say it's the late 20s and the 30s. And it was, vital until many of the store owners, restaurateurs were carted off to concentration camps. And alas, many of them lost everything. Even if they had left it in the hands of, quote, capable people, sometimes that wasn't quite the case. Let me see. We're moving along here. This person wants to know a little bit about your what you teach.
I'm a professor of American Studies, and I was the founder of teaching the courses about Japanese American identity and culture. And so I teach courses, about the history and the culture of Japanese Americans, and I teach it from a humanities perspective. I'm what you call a humanities professor. And I teach in terms of when I talk about history, it's more a human drama, and I'm very interested in history is about people-to-people relations and people making decisions and trying to be good and good to others. And that's the approach we take in the humanities. Hawaii is a wonderful place to be teaching a course, because of the mixed culture, in the background. But I also teach a war course, and it's a course of World War II, America, and Japan. And that is also a class that many of the students are interested in. I teach about 140 students, every semester, and that's been like for 52 years. So it's been a wonderful privilege, for me. To be honest with you, and I feel kind of selfish, I learn more from my students than I could ever teach them, and their family stories and they share, share with me.
Let's take one more question before we wrap it up. This person wants to know, actually I can help you with this one. Do they allow visitors to Manzanar? Yes, they do allow visitors to Manzanar, and you can go online. It's a state park, and you can go online and visit Manzanar. It's very worthwhile. It's an incredible, profound, and moving experience. So, Dennis, thank you very much. I'm sure you have given all of us some wonderful memories of yours and some thoughts about sort of wonderful, as you said, patience and understanding other people. So with that, I thank you again, and I will turn this program back to Tom Clays, who will give us some final words. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, and thank you, Libby. The program was wonderful. I want to thank the program committee and every individual of that committee that's worked on this lecture, including Steve Loper, Libby Motika, Libby Pacharis, and Allison Knight. Thank you very much. We can't do these things without you and all the amazing hours of volunteer work you guys put in. We want to again thank Boston Properties and Pankow Builders for their sponsorship. And please watch for our next lecture in the series, which will occur late in April and will feature the historic Jewish community in Santa Monica and Venice. If you like what you heard, please share our lecture information with friends and family. And if you haven't had a chance and you'd like to donate, please go ahead and text the word give and the phone number here, quick, write it down. We very much appreciate, these lectures, we try to cover the cost of this between your donations and sponsorships. So we very much appreciate you helping. Thank you very much and have a great evening.